All right, we're back in our series. Sermon number 3. We began by looking at the formation of marriage. We went all to the very inception. The marriage ceremony was performed in the Garden of Eden. And it was officiated over by God Himself. The formation. Let's look at fruits of marriage. As I said this morning, just in the same way that a healthy fruit-bearing tree will provide its fruit, a healthy marriage will produce certain fruits as well. Tonight we're looking at foes. The foes of marriage. A foe is an enemy. It's someone who is against someone or something. That's a foe. There's a lot of them out there. People who specialize in being military strategists. Those who help our armed forces to be able to engage in battle. We'll tell you that one of the top priorities in fighting an enemy is to know your enemy. To know as much about your enemy as you possibly can. It's in athletics. A person, for example, who plays basketball, if they are a student of the sport, they will observe, they will watch whoever it is they're guarding. And they'll pick up on the fact that they have a tendency to go to the right or to the left. And they will exploit that. It's much about knowing your enemy. That's what we want to do tonight. In light of the fact that marriage is so much, and the family in general is so much under fire, we need to understand our enemy, our foe. And I think without saying, we can put right at the top, if you need to put a name with it or a proverbial face with it, just think about Satan. Because he is enemy number one of the family. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at several things that would fall into a category of being an adversary to marriage. The first one that I put down called an unbiblical partner. Now what we're going to share in this first part, all you single folks out there, we're going to deal with you first. All of you single guys and gals. One of the mistakes that so many single people do is that they make the mistake of killing their marriage before it ever begins. Before it ever starts. I want you to look at some of God's rules. First, there is what I call His sexual criteria. Marriage, a biblical partner, is to be one of the opposite sex. I want to emphasize that. A biblical partner is to be one of the opposite sex. Now, I'm not going to say a whole lot about that, not because I'm shy. You'll find that out when we do 4. Sermon 4 will really deal with that. We'll wear that out. But I wanted to emphasize. So when you hear so much talk about same-sex marriage, and all these folks who are coming along and who are promoting this ideal of men and women in a marriage situation, rest assured that that is an enemy to marriage. Again, we'll get into that in Sermon 4. Sexual criteria. Another question, are they sexually pure? Sexually pure. Write this down in your mind. Now remember, we're talking to those who are not married. Listen. If the person that you're considered marrying will run around with you, they'll run around on you. Write that down. Nail that down. If they'll run around with you, they'll run around on you. How many young women's lives have been so messed up because they fell head over heels with someone who's already married? And they have to have them. If that fellow is running around on the he already has, he'll run around on you. Is your assumed partner sexually pure? This is God's criteria. Sexual criteria. Second, now remember, we're noting enemies of marriage, and we're talking about unbiblical partners. The second one was scriptural criteria. Simple question, are they a believer? Are they a believer? Now we're assuming that those here tonight who are single are believers. You're considering a future spouse. Are they a believer? Simple question. Is that God's program? Absolutely. Absolutely. I have married people before who had gone through failed relationships, sometimes not even of their own doing. They went through a divorce. There are those who will not. I respect that. That's between them and God. I have probably said yes to marrying some people that some other people would say absolutely not. there's been some times that I've said no. And the times that I have said no is when someone come to me who I knew was a believer and they couldn't tell me. And if they don't know, then there's a good chance they aren't. They could not tell me that the person that they were considering married was a believer. And I've told them, I'm sorry, I can't do that. Where do you get your basis? Look at this. Paul writing, 2 Corinthians 6, verse 15. He said, "Be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers." He's talking to the church. He's talking to believers. Be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. Yoked together. Marriage. A bond. For what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness? And what communion hath light with darkness? There have been so many, particularly young women, gone into a relationship and they've said, I'll change him. I love this guy. And I'll change him. I'll lead faith in Christ. And I will acknowledge that there have been a few situations where that's happened. But I must tell you also that there has been a lot more situations in which the opposite thing has happened. Instead of leading that unbeliever to Christ, the believer has been led away from Christ. That's what happens the majority of the time. I want you to get this. I look around this congregation and you're a pretty conservative looking group. I can imagine anyone in this group tonight that would consider marrying one of the same sex, because you would say that's sin. Listen to what I'm going to tell you. It's just as much sin for a believer to marry an unbeliever. Just as much of a sin in the eyes of God. What does an biblical partner mean? Well, we see God's sexual criteria, His scriptural criteria. Notice the spiritual criteria. We began with another question. Here it is. Have you really prayed? Have you really? Have you asked God, Lord, is this the person that I am to spend the rest of my life with? I hope before you married the person that you're with, if you're married, I hope you prayed about that. My wife and I have not done everything in our courtship and in our marriage. We've made mistakes. But I feel certain that both of us prayed to make sure that we were the one for each other. Have you prayed about it? Have you realistically gone to God in prayer and this person that you're just head over heels in love with, is this the will of God? Because if it isn't the will of God, listen to what I'm telling you. It would be better for you to remain single than to get into a relationship and not have the blessing or the will of God upon it. Sexual criteria, scriptural criteria, spiritual criteria, and then I call this one just sensible criteria. Now we're getting into an area that we in East Tennessee like to call just good old common horse sense. Let me throw a couple of questions for you to consider. Do they have a job? What's that got to do with it? It's got a whole lot to do with it. Somebody is going to have to pay a mortgage payment. You're going to have an automobile. You've got utilities. You've got to buy food. Do they have a job? It's practical. Oh, preacher, we live on love. Good luck with that. Go down to the bank and tell them when they're about ready to kick you out of the house, oh, we're living on love. See how far that gets you. Do they have a job? I wrote this down. Are they close to your age? Are they close to your age? Now, women tend to become mature much earlier on than men. Much earlier on. That's the reason the majority of the time you'll find that the husband is several years sometimes older than the wife. It's because the wife a long time before the husband did. That's basically what men are always playing catch up. Yeah. And I wouldn't even think, 10, 12 years. I don't pay a lot of attention. What really gets me is these guys that are 60 and 70 years old marrying these 20-year-old women. I don't get it. That makes absolutely no sense to me whatsoever. None. Except I think some of these guys sometimes, because they've dyed their hair and they've bought them a Corvette, they're going through something in their life and they got to prove to themselves. And what better way is to ditch the old bag you're with now and get a young one. It happen all the time. Are you close, at least close in age? Now we're talking about just sensible things. Does your assumed spouse have an addiction? Do they abuse alcohol, drugs? Are they involved in pornography? And the list goes on and on and on. Is there something in their life you're going to have to share because you're a partner that you shouldn't have to share? These are just very, very simple, practical, sensible questions. Unbiblical partner. The second thing I wrote down is an unrealistic picture. What I mean by this is going into marriage with unrealistic expectations. What young girl has not grown up in a fantasy world where she looks at marriage and she's Cinderella, and she's looking at marriage and it's just going to be perfect. It's going to be so wonderful. She's never going to have a problem Her hubby is going to come in and he is just going to sweep her off of her feet. And he's going to do everything for her. All the problems gone. No, 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 no. If you go into a marriage with those kind of expectations, you'll be in trouble quickly. Let me tell you something. Marriage requires work. And all of you that are married at about that time, you should have said amen. Marriage requires work. You work at a marriage. It doesn't just happen. You work it. I heard the greatest story. Oh, it's good. There was this guy. He fell in love with an opera singer. Now I love music and I have an appreciation for about any kind of music, and I can listen to an opera singer and say, they're very good at what they do. I'm not going to listen very long to it, but I can appreciate what they do. This guy loved opera music. And one of the venues that he loved to go to, there was a certain woman who had this beautiful operatic voice. It was just gorgeous. This man fell in love with a woman's voice. So much, in fact, that he asked her out. She went, and in a whirlwind courtship, which lasted hardly any time, they got married. Honeymoon night. She excuses herself into the bathroom, where she removes her false eyelashes. She takes off her wig. She washes off all of her makeup. She takes out her teeth. She removes her prosthetic leg. She walks out into the doorway and says, "What do you think?" He says, "Sing, baby, sing." Yeah. Unrealistic expectations. I want to remind you again, marriage requires work. Work. And it's work that must be done on both parties' part. The third thing that I wrote down was unimportant priorities. Unimportant priorities. You know, one of the mistakes I think that a lot of couples make, quit courting. And some of you young people don't know what courting is. You know, call it dating or whatever. When I was a boy, we called it courting. Most young people today, courting is when they have to go down, before the judge. No, courting. He went up to the lake, Terry, and parked in a field somewhere. Yeah. Yeah, and these guys like Nick come around all the time, shining lights in him. Yeah. That was courting. Yeah. That was a lot of fun. And it's sad, but it's true, that sometimes married people stop courting. I want to challenge you husbands, because you ought to take the lead in this. I want to challenge you husbands to take your wife out on a date. Leave your grandchild with its grandparents. The grandchild and the grandparents both love that anyway. Just leave them with them. And go out on a date. Just the two of you. Don't ever stop courting. I think one of the greatest hindrances to marriage, because marriage can become so complicated. You're trying to balance a relationship together as husband and wife, being a parent. You've got financial issues that you have to deal with. All these things that are going on. You have career, all these other things. And you stop paying attention to the one who should be on top of your priority list, and that's your spouse. I told that young couple that I married right here a couple of weekends ago. Same thing that I've told many. The number one relationship in your life is to be your relationship with God. That's number one. And because you're married, that should never change. Never. But the relationship in your life after you become husband and wife is that relationship. And I'll even go farther and tell you that if God blesses you with children, that relationship with your spouse is still at the top. It's still at the top. It's the number one relationship. Top billing. Keep your spouse on top of the priority list. The thing I wrote down was ungodly pride. Ungodly pride. Now, pride is one of those words, anger is another, that we look at sometimes and think, oh, that's bad, 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 bad. No, not all anger is bad. There's times when it's appropriate to be angry. Do you think that Brian, do you think Jesus was a little aggravated, a little angry when He went in and cleaned house, when they were trying to sell and make a store, a venue out of the house of God? He evidently was. He cleaned house. He was overturning tables right and left. I think He was angry. And when you and I see some of the atrocities and things going on in our world today, we should get angry. There's nothing wrong with that. Righteous indignation. It's okay. Now there is wrong, obviously. But all anger isn't. Pride is the same way. Pride can be sinful. If we take pride and show pride in some way which keeps the focus on us and what we are and draws it away from God, it's wrong. But there's a whole lot of times that pride's good. If you're a child of God, you ought to be proud. You ought to be proud to be a child of God. And if the church that you attend, whether it's this one or whatever, if the church that you attend is a place where your spiritual needs are being met, you ought to be proud of it. You ought to be proud of it. If I went to a church and I wasn't proud of it, I'd go hunt me another one. Now, I'll just be honest with you. If it's a place where I feel that my spiritual needs are being met, I won't have a bit of problem with standing up and say, I am a member at Beck Mountain Baptist Church. I'm proud of it. There's nothing wrong with it. But I'm talking about ungodly pride. That's what hurts in a marriage. Let me give you an example. There's a spat in the relationship. And while both parties may be a little guilty, sometimes at least one of the parties may be an overriding person in this. And deep down in their heart they know it. They know it. But rather than do the thing they should do, which is to go to their spouse and say, listen, hon, I just want you to know I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I said something to you. I responded to you in some way. I was completely off base. I shouldn't have done that. And I want you to know I'm sorry. You know what keeps people from doing that? Pride. Pride. And it's one of the real hindrances to a healthy marriage. A bad sense of pride. I want to challenge you. Never hold on to so much pride that you can't say to your spouse, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. It's untelling how many marriages have failed by the wayside. Because someone, or maybe even both, were not willing to swallow their pride. The fifth one and the final one I called unfaithful promiscuity. By that I mean adultery. Having sex of any type with anyone other than your spouse. And I wanted to emphasize the any type because we realize a person who was very prominent in our nation, when challenged about a relationship with a woman, said, I did not have sexual intercourse with that woman. So somehow that made it all right. No. No, it didn't make it all right. No. No, it didn't. Now you can go with your mind everywhere you want to as far as to what went on. That was unfaithfulness. That was adultery. And it was wrong. The envelope a little farther. Do you know that being flirty with someone other than your spouse is unhealthy to that relationship? God in heaven only knows how many marriages are down the tube and gone right now. I could sit down and just start writing marriage after marriage. Because some of them I've been back there in the office with. Not necessarily all people from here at the church, some of them, but just people I know who were trying to save their marriage. I've sat back there and listened to their stories many times. And oftentimes there was friction in the relationship. And the wife or the husband did not feel that their spouse was understanding what they were going through. So at work, at work, there just so happened to be someone there who had a listening ear. And they were all too ready. Particularly if it was a man. They were all too ready to listen. And so many times they had another motive. And they listened. And they said the right things. They picked up on what that person needed to hear. They said the right things. Up a marriage. I have seen it happen over and over and over and over. stay away from flirtiness. Certainly stay away from those things, sexual things. Conversations outside of those with your own spouse. Stay away from those with a member of the opposite sex. It leads to danger, trouble. And all the marriages that have been destroyed because of it. I hope tonight that we've been able to identify some of the foes of marriage. Remember, one of them's an unbeliever. Young person, those of you who are not married, never consider, if you are a believer, never consider marrying anyone who isn't. You got that? Now, if you're not a believer, if you're not a Christian, you just marry who you want to. But if you're a believer, don't you ever consider marrying someone who isn't. It's got danger written all over it. Unrealistic picture. Just remember that lady in the doorway. What do you think? Remember that. Unimportant priorities. Who is number one? Our relationship with God, correct? Who is number two? Our relationship with our spouse. Top priority. Ungodly pride. Never make the mistake of not being able to say, honey, I want to tell you, being able to do that, anything at all to do with gender, but I'll just use the term, if you really want to show yourself to be a man, whether you be male or female, and I don't mean that in some stupid way, if you really want to be the bigger person, be the one who goes and says, honey, I made a mistake. I was just wrong. And finally, unfaithful promiscuity. Stay pure in your marriage. Stay true to the one whom God gave you. Let's bow. If you've never given your heart and life to the Lord Jesus Christ, I would encourage you to do that this day. Even before you leave this house of God, go to someone. I offer myself as someone you can talk to. Reach out and say, along with that jailer thousands of years ago, sirs, what must I do to be saved? Do that. Do that tonight. Young people, even if you're not at this time at marrying age, whatever that is, listen to what God has shared this night in this service. Listen to that criteria, because it's so important. Couples, do the sensible things. Do the right things. What you'll have? Your marriage will have a little heaven on earth. It really will. I had a friend tell me one time, and I think he's true, marriage can be the worst thing that ever happened to you, or it can be the best thing that ever happened to you. Keep that in mind. Let's stand. Don't forget, we are having choir